Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in today's video we are going to discuss the compartmentalization of body fluids and how this is important for human physiology. The body compartmentalizes a lot of different processes, whether they be physiological processes at the macroscopic level or chemical reactions at the microscopic level, to make sure that the function of one process does not in any way interfere with the function of another. So the body does this in a couple of different ways. At the macroscopic level, we have anatomical compartments. In that way, we are talking about body cavities and sheaths like the meninges that surround the brain and spinal cord, and then also the different body cavities that house your different organs and major tissues. And then at the microscopic level, we're going to be talking about cellular and molecular compartments. In this way, we're talking about the different body fluids, and we'll talk a little bit about how they are different in terms of their composition and how physiological processes will often involve complex movement of molecules from one compartment to another and back again. So here you can see a couple of illustrations at the macroscopic level. On the left, you can see some of the different body cavities and some of the common organs that you find contained within. In the cranial cavity, of course, you find the brain, and then you have a separate cavity that houses the spinal cord. In the upper thoracic cavity, you're going to find major organs like the heart and the lungs. And then separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity below is the diaphragm. In the abdominopelvic cavity, you're going to find organs like the kidneys, the organs of the digestive system, and then organs of the urinary and reproductive systems. And then another common theme that we're going to encounter later in the semester when we start talking about some of these organs in particular is that many internal organs are encased in what are called serous membranes. These are pairs of fluid-filled membranes that coat the outside surface of organs like the heart and the lungs. Here you can actually see that this serous membrane that surrounds the heart is called the pericardium. And these serous membranes, like I said, come in pairs, a visceral membrane and a parietal membrane. The general idea is that the visceral membrane is positioned right up against the surface of the organ, so you can see the visceral membrane right up against the myocardial surface of the heart right here. And then the parietal membrane on the outside surface generally is attached to the cavity wall itself, in this case, the thoracic cavity wall. But what I want to spend most of our time in this video talking about is the microscopic compartmentalization that we see in the body. The first thing to understand is that all fluids in the body are separated from each other by cell membranes. And cell membrane structure and function, of course, is something that we will be talking about in a separate video later on. So what the membrane does for now is it prevents the contents of each kind of body fluid from directly mixing together, again, to make sure that, say, a chemical reaction happening in one kind of fluid does not interfere with or mix together with something else happening in a different body fluid. And each kind of body fluid we're going to discuss maintains concentrations of solutes and other materials in different proportions, so this is why it's important that we have cell membranes to keep these things separate. Okay, let's introduce some terminology associated with body fluid compartmentalization. So what I've illustrated here is a very common thing that you find in the body. You have some cells here that belong to some organ or tissue. So this could be cells of skeletal muscle, they could be cells of the heart, they could be cells of the lungs, they could be cells of the liver. And then you also have a capillary, which is carrying blood and supplying these cells here with nutrients and other things that are being carried in the blood. So the first type of body fluid we want to introduce is called intracellular fluids, sometimes abbreviated as ICF. You'll notice that this intracellular fluid, which literally means fluid found inside of cells, not only belongs to these large tissue cells here, but also these cells that make up the wall of the blood vessel itself. You have 30 to 40 trillion cells in your body, and each one of them contains some fraction of the overall intracellular fluid. You might be interested to learn that 60 to 70% of all the water in your body is actually contained in this intracellular fluid compartment. And then you have two different types of what we call extracellular fluid, fluid found outside of the cells. First, you have what we call the interstitial fluid, which is a type of extracellular fluid that basically bathes and surrounds all of the cells of the body. And then you have another kind of extracellular fluid, which is the blood plasma. Blood plasma is distinct from interstitial fluid because blood plasma is obviously contained within blood vessels. The cells that actually make up the wall of the blood vessel in this case are called vascular endothelial cells. They're easy to forget about, but do not forget they are cells and they do possess their own intracellular fluid. And then the other thing that you'll notice about this illustration is that these vascular endothelial cells have little gaps in between them called fenestrations. Those will become important in what I intend to illustrate on the next slide. But the most important thing is that the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid are separated from each other by the existence of plasma membranes, which is something that every cell in the body has. So this plasma membrane prevents the mixing of the contents of the intracellular fluid with the contents of the extracellular fluid. Okay, so let's use our new terminology here to illustrate something that we talked about in the last video. In the last video, we said that one of the major ways in which cell-to-cell communication happens in the body is by hormones traveling through the blood. So here you can see a hormone that is positioned inside of the blood plasma, and then here you can see an effector cell that is going to receive that hormonal message and then produce some kind of desired physiological response, probably for maintaining homeostasis. In order for this hormone to do its job, it needs to move from the blood plasma through one of those fenestrations, those little gaps in between the vascular endothelial cells, into the interstitial fluid, and then it binds to a receptor protein that is positioned on the surface of one of those tissue cells. Engagement between that hormone and the receptor protein is in some way going to lead to a change in physiological function for this cell that responds, and that response is going to produce some kind of desired outcome, whether it be an increase in blood pressure, a decrease in blood glucose, or something of that nature. But what you can clearly see here is an illustration of how body fluids and compartmentalization play an important role in something happening like this. So there's your effector cell right there, and the thing you'll notice here is that the effector cell is distinct from these two non-effector cells over here because the effector cell has the receptor for that hormone. These two cells here, because they do not have the receptor protein, they cannot respond to the hormone. So that's an important lesson we're going to learn now and also again in the future. So continuing on with this discussion, the cell membrane maintains what we call osmotic equilibrium. The concentration of water in each kind of body fluid compartment is pretty much the same, and that's going to be something we talk a little bit more in the future. So the amount of water in the intracellular compartment is roughly comparable to the proportion of water in the extracellular compartment. However, the membrane does not maintain chemical equilibrium. It maintains chemical disequilibrium. What we mean by this is that solute concentrations, things like sodium and potassium and glucose, things of that nature, they are kept intentionally unequal. We do not want those things to ever get to the point where they are in equilibrium, where the concentration of sodium is exactly the same in the intracellular compartment and the extracellular compartment. To give you the idea of what the reality of chemical disequilibrium is, let's graph out some of the relative concentrations of some important solutes in the different bodily fluids. You can see I have this graph split between the ICF, the intracellular fluid, and then the two major types of extracellular fluid. If we start with sodium, you will notice that there is a lot more sodium in the extracellular fluids than there is in the intracellular fluids. The importance of that is not super important right now, but it will become very important in the future, so you might want to remember this. Similarly, if we look at potassium, it's the exact opposite. There's a lot more potassium in the intracellular fluid than there is in the extracellular fluid. We see sort of the same thing with chloride. There tends to be more chloride in the extracellular fluid than the intracellular fluid. Calcium's an interesting story because there is practically no calcium in the intracellular fluid, but a decent amount of it in the extracellular fluid. And then finally, if you look at proteins, there's a lot of protein inside of cells, very little in the interstitial fluid, and then a decent amount in the blood plasma. We will talk about the importance of these discrepancies in solute concentration as the semester goes on, but for now, the one I would like you to really remember and really try to commit to memory is the discrepancy with sodium and potassium, because that will become exceedingly important in the future. Okay, that's going to just about do it for this video. Here is a list of vocabulary terms I think you ought to look into or know after this video, and then some check your understanding questions just to kind of assess your learning so far. What purpose does compartmentalization of organs into body cavities serve? How are body fluids compartmentalized, and what is the barrier separating them? Which ions are kept in intentional disequilibrium across the cell membrane? And what roles do cell membranes and body fluids play in cell-to-cell communication? Okay, that's going to do it for this video. If you have a question, leave it in the comments section, and I will see you next time. So long.